Welcome to the Lyberg conference. I am so proud to welcome everyone from near and far. You are almost 400 people from all over the world participating today. Welcome to everyone following via YouTube and welcome to all of you here in the city center of Stockholm. The future of market research is full of challenges and opportunities. New technologies, declining response rates, and the need for speed enables new methods, faster analytics, and report creation. Lars Lyberg and I met many years ago in Stockholm over a lunch to discuss survey quality. That conversation was ongoing since then. Lars joined us at Demoskop as a senior advisor after a successful career at Statistics Sweden. His contribution to our success cannot be emphasized enough. His passion about quality and to explore what is next was inspiring. Lars, or Lasse, was one of the giants in the field of survey research. Unfortunately, he passed away earlier this year. To honor his memory and to continue the important work he did, we have created the Lyberg Conference. And actually, today, December 1st, would have been his 77th birthday. You will today listen to some of the leading scientists and experts in the world sharing their view on the new survey landscape. I am so proud to welcome Dr. Lili Japek, Professor Andrew Gelman, Professor Paul Beamer, Dr. Stephanie Ekman, Professor Frauke Krauter, and Dr. Johanna Laio Kaurane. We will have a 15-minute coffee break and we'll finish the conference with a panel discussion. I also want to encourage you to comment or write questions in the chat function, and we will try to answer some of them. If you want to tweet, please use the hashtag Lyberg Conference. But now, let me introduce Dr. Lili Japek, Scientific Advisor at Statistics Sweden.
Thank you, Karin. I first like to thank Karin for this wonderful initiative in memory of my husband. And thank you, Karin, for also inviting me to do the introduction today. I first met Lars in '93 when we both worked at Stat Sweden. Over the years, Lars and I worked on many projects together, and it was always great fun to work together with Lars. In my introduction today, I will talk about Lars, the leader that was always a step ahead. Lars, sorry, okay. Lars held many formal leading positions throughout his life. He was the director of the R&D department at Stat Sweden for many years and also professor at the University of Stockholm. Lars was also very active in the international arena. When I was preparing this introduction, I was thinking of which of his activities I would highlight, because the list when it comes to service to the profession is really very long. It's 2 pages. So I decided just to take a random sample from all of his contributions, just to give you a flavor of the different areas where Lars contributed over the years. He was the vice president of the International Association for Survey Statisticians during the late 80s, and he also chaired the ASA Survey Research Method section early 2000. In Sweden, he was also chairing the working group on the ISO standard for market opinion and social research. And on the European level, he really contributed with the way we view quality today within the European statistical system. And that work was started with Lars chairing the leadership group on quality late 90s. Lars was a great source of inspiration to many of us in survey research, not just at Stats Sweden and Demoskop, but actually around the corner, different parts of the world. Lars always, sorry, oops. Lars always saw the big picture, and he would pinpoint the critical areas to address. So, for example, during the early 80s, he was worried about many practitioners and statisticians working with official statistics. They were not reading journal articles, nor were they writing journal articles. And he wanted to change that. And at that time, many of the journals in our field were quite technical. And this is when he started the Journal of Official Statistics in 1985. He also modernized the JOS. And early 2000, mid 2000, the journal went digital and it was free to download articles from the journal. And I think that was the first journal within our field where you could download it, articles for free. When I first started at Stats Sweden, the focus was on sampling errors and sampling. Lars was really the first one that I heard talk about non-sampling errors and the impact they can have on survey estimates. And I think Lars made many of us realize how important it is to have a system of quality assurance and quality control in place when doing a survey. Again, Lars was focusing on the big picture, that is the total survey error. And he was really key to the quality management movement within official statistics in Europe. Another example of an area where Lars played a critical role is the CSDI area. Can you hear me? Because it's okay. Thank you. Lars knew that unless you pay careful attention to surveys and how you design surveys and how you implement them, it's really very hard to do comparisons between countries. And even if you do everything in terms of design and implementation of methods by the book, it is still hard to do comparisons between countries because of, for example, cultural differences between countries. And here he worked together with many colleagues to initiate the CSDI workshop, and that workshop is still going strong. My final example of Lars being at the forefront is the current situation where we are today with a lot of new data, big data sources. And many national statistical institutes are struggling with how to use those data sources to produce statistics. Lars very early on talked about the changing survey landscape with declining response rate, increased user demands, and increased cost to carry out surveys. He talked about the importance of studying those new data sources and new methods to deal with the new survey landscape. He also realized that this is an area, okay, thank you. Is this better? I'm not sure this is working either. Okay, this is better. He also realized that this is an area where we need to work across borders, not just international borders, but other types of borders. Survey methodologists, data scientists, subject matter specialists, government, academia, private sector. And the idea to initiate the Big Serve conference and monograph came out of this conviction that we really need to work together across different borders. Lars often, keep forgetting this, sorry. Okay. Lars often got invited to teach or speak at different events, and he would travel around the world to give lectures on different topics, such as total survey error, quality management, or comparative survey design and implementation. He would travel to many countries, but his favorite was really the US. And he really liked the US even when he was a little boy. And he told me a story when he was around 4 years old. And his grandmother would serve him a meal with carrots. And he didn't like carrots. So he refused to eat the carrots. Then his grandmother told him that the carrots were from the US. Then he would eat the carrots. I've already mentioned some of the workshops and conferences that Lars initiated, and there's so many ad hoc conferences and uh, workshops that Lars initiated, so they wouldn't fit on one slide. But here I listed some of the recurring workshops that are still going on and conferences. I do like to mention the non-response workshop because that workshop has been going on for 30 plus years and it's still very popular. It's an annual workshop, and here Lars initiated this together with Bob Groves, Bob Barnes, and Mick Cooper in 1990. And they saw that there were really two groups working on non-response. One group was working on reducing non-response rates, and the other one was working on adjusting for non-response. And they thought that these two groups really need to talk to each other, to learn from each other. And that was the main idea behind that workshop. And the photo that you see here is from when we were planning the Big Serve 18 conference and monograph. And as you can see, we had great fun doing that. Lars also co-author and co-edited a number of books and monographs, and you can see them here. Lars never stopped working, and there are actually 3 books that came out this year. And unfortunately, Lars did not have the chance to see those books. One is the Big Data Meets Survey Science book, the monograph from the conference. And then there are 2 volumes that just came out 2 weeks ago, and that he edited together with Ove Engel and other colleagues, Handbook on Computational Social Science. One book that Lars was particularly proud of was the one that he wrote together with Paul Beamer in 2003, Introduction to Survey Quality. And that was quite an accomplishment. Both Lars and Paul got invited to travel to different countries and to give courses based on their book. And I know that they had a lot of fun doing that. Okay. Lars won many awards, and here you can see a list of all of the awards that Lars received. Unfortunately, Lars passed away before he got the last reward, the Warren Mitofsky Innovators Award. And he shared that award with Craig Hill, Paul Beamer, Anshe Kirchner, and myself for the Big Serve initiative. Lars was very proud of all of the awards that he received. But I think the biggest award that he received was when he won Gaia's Heart. Gaia is our cat that we adopted from a cat shelter in 2014. And she was really scared of people when we got her first, but eventually she came around, and Lars and Gaia had a very special bond. It was always fun to be around Lars, and his great sense of humor and his kindness was truly unique. And I like to end this introduction with a quote by Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Lars made people feel appreciated and good about themselves. This is a true gift. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Lily, and that was really how I feel that I know Lars. We are now moving on to our first speaker, Professor Andrew Gelman. He is a professor of statistics and political science at Columbia University. Welcome, Andrew.
Oh, hello. Let's see, you can hear me, correct? So I never had a chance to meet the person for whom this conference was named, but I appreciate his contributions for many reasons. His work on real-world surveys, from data collection to analysis, and his career as an author, of books, his academic service as a researcher, teacher, and editor, and maybe especially his decades of government service, which is so important to survey sampling and to statistics in general. An important aspect of his work that's particularly relevant to me was his recognition of the importance of all sorts of error, as was mentioned earlier. Not just the sampling error that's the focus of traditional statistical theory, but also error that is measurement error, non-response, and other challenges that have not gone away. Now, I've long felt that measurement error is the most important part of statistics that's not usually taught. And this is truer than ever in the modern big data era. If we can think of the three challenges of statistics as being generalizing from sample to population, generalizing from control to treatment group, and generalizing from observed data to underlying constructs of interest. Each of these becomes more difficult with big data. But with big data, we don't have random samples. We have available data. We have whoever we manage to reach. We don't have randomly assigned treatments. We have observational data. And also, we typically don't get to design the measurements ourselves. We use the measurements that are out there, which requires additional modeling to connect them to what we ultimately care about. So I like to say that big data needs big model. And it's kind of funny because sometimes traditionally in statistics, we think of modeling and data as like counterparts to each other. So the more data you have, the less modeling you need. And that's true if you have a random sample or a randomized experiment, but not really true in a modern big data world. And I'll get back to that a little bit. First, I wanted to talk briefly about each of these challenges of statistics. So the first, of generalizing from sample to population, is obviously connected to survey research, and in particular survey adjustment and post-stratification. I think the thing that we just have to remember is that these are tasks that need to be done whether or not we have a random sample, whether or not we have a probability sample. We still need to generalize. An example that came up in our research a few years ago was what we call differential non-response. what was happening in pre-election polls was that you would have one candidate who was doing better in the polls. There was good news about that candidate. The candidate's supporters would be more likely to respond to surveys. Supporters of the other side were less likely to respond. So you get a feedback loop where when a candidate did a little bit better in public opinion, they would do a lot better in the polls. So whatever small swings in opinion were happening would be reflected by big swings in the polls. This was more of a problem in recent years than it used to be. So when I got started in this field, that I don't think this was such an issue. Why is that? Well, there are two reasons. One is survey response rates are a lot lower than they used to be. So this kind of feedback effect can be much more dramatic. Whether you respond to a poll at all is much more contingent on conditions than it used to be back when response rates were 50% or higher. The other is that in the United States, at least, we have strong political polarization, which means not that many people change their views. And so the underlying opinion is very stable. So we're in a situation where you could say the signal has become weaker, or the changes in the signal have become weaker, and the noise has become higher. The second problem is generalizing from control to treatment group, or causal inference. And there, this is, to embed this in the sample survey world, we have to realize that we're not typically interested in causal inference about the people in our experiment. We're interested in the general population. So if there's a study of some treatment for coronavirus, they'll do it on some patients in the hospital. We're interested not just in the people in this particular hospital of this particular age profile at this stage of the disease, but what would happen if you apply it elsewhere. From a statistical standpoint, that means that we need to estimate varying treatment effects. And we have to avoid what we sometimes call the fallacy of the randomized experiment. The fallacy of the randomized experiment is to think that if you have a randomized controlled trial, then you're done and you have perfect statistical inference. Actually, you only get inference about the people in the trial. You still need to somehow post-stratify or otherwise generalize to the larger population. So all of the things that we know about for survey sampling are actually important, not just for survey sampling, but for other problems that aren't considered to be sampling at all. Finally, there's the problem of measurement. This comes up a lot in political science, where we're interested in some underlying measures of ideology or issue attitudes, and we have survey questions. As we know, even if you ask a question directly about a particular issue, you will not, the survey response is not necessarily how people would feel if the issue became a live issue politically. So we'll need to ask many questions and form modeling, do statistical modeling to make predictions for what we actually care about. And that's true in marketing research as well. So lots of things will do well in the survey, but then not sell so well in the real world. So I think so far I've given maybe a typical talk on sampling because I've been talking about analysis. And analysis is the glamour boy of statistics, and it's what everybody wants to hear about and write about. But today I want to talk a little bit about design. So there's a principle that of history, and that is to understand the past, we must first know the future. And I think, as I said, that's familiar when we think of historical studies. If you want to understand the wisdom of some political decision, you have to kind of know what happened afterwards. In statistical design, the relevance of this principle is that we can really only design a study well if we know how we're going to analyze it. Knowing the analysis implies certain things about the design. There are two steps of sampling, design and analysis. Analysis should respect design, for example, adjusting for stratification and clustering, and design should anticipate analysis. For example, collecting relevant background variables to be used in a non-response adjustment. And the easiest way to think about it is to say, imagine that you just collected the data and now it's time to analyze the data. Think about all the things that you wished you had. Let's go back in time and gather those things. So let's try not going back in time. Let's say that classical statistical design is out of date, because classical statistical design is what data do you gather to do a classical statistical analysis? And that is, you want to know the probability of selection of every unit in the population. Knowing the probability of selection of every unit in the population is both not enough and too much. It's not enough because it doesn't solve the small area estimation problem. And that can be seen by recognizing that what if you had a simple random sample with equal probability of inclusion for everybody in the survey? That still won't tell you how to do small area estimation. It still won't give you good estimates for regions of the country or for demographic subgroups that have small sample sizes. Some sort of modeling will be needed. Knowing probability of selection is also too much, in the sense that we don't know the probability of inclusion in the survey. Even if we do a random digit dial survey, that tells us the probability that someone's phone will be called. It doesn't tell you the probability that they'll be included in the sample. So that's kind of the theme of my talk, which I've carefully given myself only 9 more minutes to give it, because I don't actually have that much to say. I just think this principle is very important, and this is a direction of future research that we need, but also current practice. So we just have to start with this idea that design should respect analysis. Our analysis has changed a huge amount in the last 50 years. Our design principles are old-fashioned. Now, our design principles aren't horrible. I think that the step back from try to get a random sample is try to get something that's kind of like a random sample, which probably isn't a bad idea. But I think we can make progress by thinking more formally about the connection between design and data collection. So let me quickly go through the different aspects of this. The first is multi-level regression and post-stratification, or more generally, regularized regression and post-stratification. We can adjust for more variables than ever before. So back in the bad old days, we needed to worry about noisy weights. So we might adjust in the US survey, we might adjust for age and education and ethnicity and sex, but we might be a little scared about adjusting for various interactions. We know we should adjust for interactions between education and ethnicity are a big story in the United States, in US politics, but if you try to adjust for too many interactions using survey weighting, you get very noisy weights and you get unusable results. Using regularized regression and post-stratification, that automatically smooths, and we can adjust for a lot more things. And at this point, I'd usually talk about how to do this adjustment, progress we've made, challenges, and so forth. Today, it's all about design. So I'll say that we can adjust for more variables, so let's collect them. You can't adjust for something you haven't collected. But then more is needed. I'm talking about demographic variables, geographic variables, political variables, things that people didn't used to adjust for. We have that ability, right? Once we have faster cars, we should build better roads, right? But then more is needed. We do need to work on missing data imputation. The more variables you have, the more cases you're going to have where you can't do the simple adjustment. We need to work on creating the post-stratification table, because now we're adjusting for variables such as party identification that are not in the census. Now, there's room here for some theoretical results on adjustment for the imperfect information. And I have in mind that there's a kind of theorem that says that there's a benefit to adjustment with imputation, even if your imputation is flawed. There's a benefit to adjustment with a modeled post-stratification table. And we had an example a few years ago where we adjusted for religion, and religion was not in the census. So we actually filled the post-stratification table for religion using the data from our survey, which sounds like circular reasoning, but I think it kind of worked. I mean, it's no better than the data you have, but the post-stratification adjustment still does a kind of smoothing that I think gives better estimates. But there's, as I said, I think there's a theoretical result there to be proved, or at least some kind of study to be done on this. The next problem is, can you all hear me? Because I look kind of frozen here. Let's see. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. I'm frozen in the image, but fine, okay. The second area where analysis is advanced and design needs to catch up is small area estimation. Now that we know it's possible to do small area estimation, we should be able to do less local polling and more coordinated national polling, or polling across multiple industries rather than a single industry. In a business marketing survey, we should be able to do surveys about more different products, more companies, etc., and put this information together. So we know that we can partially pool across groups, but that suggests gathering data to recognize that. Next topic, cluster sampling. So once you think of the problem as inference from missing clusters, you'll want cluster level predictors. What's important is not the probability a cluster is selected, but what do you know about these clusters? And we're working with a real world survey, the Fragile Families study, where there were some clusters with much different sampling probabilities. Some of them were in the certainty stratum and had 100% selection probability. Others had very low selection probabilities. Traditional methods would analyze these terribly. If you do a hierarchical model, you can use all the data. But again, given that we know we can do that, we should gather the data in recognition of the analysis. And more generally, we can combine information between polls in a way that, or different modes of surveys, in a much more sophisticated way than simply analyzing each poll separately. So a lot of, like, if you have the raw data, you should be able to do a lot better than survey aggregation. Now, at this point, you might feel that there's a moral hazard. And that is, I mean, in the economic sense of the term, not that someone's doing something immoral, but if you have the ability to do inference from non-probability samples, why do probability sampling at all? Why do any kind of quality data collection at all? Why not just gather some data from people on the street and then do the magic of MRP and get your inference? Well, the quick answer is that there's a lot of evidence you'll get wrong answers from that. The longer answer is that you're concerned about biases due to unmeasured variables. This again sends us back to the idea of measuring more variables if possible, gathering better data in that sense. So quality of the data is partly sampling, but it's partly gathering high quality data on the individuals. And then if we step back one more step and talk about measurement quality, again, if we're adjusting for variables, key variable to adjust for in the US is ethnicity or race. It turns out if you ask the question different ways, you'll get different answers. In the US Census, a lot more people are reporting mixed race than ever before. It's kind of destroying our statistical methods. So these issues of data quality are just hugely important. I mean, Rich is really why I think it's wonderful that you're having a conference to honor somebody who worked on non-sampling error and data quality. I just think a lot of his ideas, the ideas of him and his collaborators they've been so important in how we analyze our data and how we collect the data. I think we can hopefully make future progress in data collection by being aware of the analysis that we can now do. So in conclusion, let me just say that I think sampling analysis is very important. It's too important to be left to the probability sampling people. It's really central to data science or learning from data or public policy and all these things. In order to do this, we need to do more modeling. We need to model varying treatment effects and interactions. And there's a large role for modern statistics and machine learning. And finally, that reflects back on design, and it suggests that we should be able to collect better quality data and more systematically and learn more using the methods that we now have available. Um, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you on this occasion.
Hello, I'm having trouble sharing my screen. Well, first of all, let me say what an honor it is to speak to you this morning. It was about 40 years ago that Lars and I first met when I was working at the Census Bureau, and he came to Washington, D.C. to visit the Census Bureau. Over the years since then, we formed a great friendship, and I deeply miss him. Um, in the movie "It's a Wonderful Life," James Stewart's character got to see what life would be, what the world would be if he had not been born. And I think in Lars's case, I think if we could do that, we would see that the field of survey methodology would be dramatically different. I think Lars had a dramatic impact on our field, and we will probably never know how much of an impact he had. Um, but because of our Census Bureau connection and some work that I've been doing recently with the Census Bureau, I thought it would be appropriate to share some work that I did to evaluate the 2020 census, and it's a topic that I think Lars would enjoy. It's about the census. It's also about total uncertainty. I refer to it as total census uncertainty, and I hope you enjoy it as well. So, could I have the next slide? So, I want to first acknowledge my colleagues who work with me on this project, Joe Salvo and Jonathan Auerbach. Also want to acknowledge the support from the American Statistical Association Task Force on 2020 Census Data Quality, and also the Census Bureau, who cooperated with this endeavor. There is a report out. I've gotten the link there that this talk is going to be based on, and I encourage you to look at that link if you would like to learn more about what I'm going to be saying this morning or this afternoon. So, next slide, please. So the way this talk is going to progress is I'm going to first of all give some background, goals, and objectives of the work. I'll discuss the methodology, share some results, and then have a summary of the major findings. Next slide, please. So why did we do this project? Well, after the 2020 census, or maybe even before the 2020 census was even finished, there was a lot of concern from constituents, from data users, from the public in general about the quality of the census because of the pandemic, because of other natural disasters, and also because of some of the politics that were going on during the census that might have, with these other factors, interfered with the data collection. So, in response to that, the American Statistical Association formed a task force that recommended that an independent analysis of the census be done, looking at census data quality. And they asked me and my two co-authors to conduct this analysis starting in November of 2020, and we finished in July of 2021, not too long after the apportionment counts were released. Um, Now, unfortunately, as you all know, or hopefully most of you know, that every census, the Census Bureau conducts a post-enumeration survey, which provides direct evidence of error in the census. But the post-enumeration survey is just finishing up, and the results won't be released for a number of months yet. So, what we were asked to do is to consider sort of proxy measures of coverage error. Um, the ASA task force called them quality indicators. We refer to them as process statistics because they're, researches need to be done to understand exactly what these process statistics say about data quality. And I also want to emphasize that we were only looking at apportionment counts, that is the state population counts. There's another group, the Committee on National Statistics, that's going to be looking more at substate uh, data quality, again using process statistics. Next slide, please. Could I have the next? Yes. So our major objectives, there were actually two key research questions that we were going to focus on. Um, the a lot of focus on comparing 2020 census with 2010 because, again, those things that made 2020 so unique in terms of the pandemic and other natural disasters, hurricanes, fires in the West, and so forth. And 2010 was more of a sort of a typical census. So we wanted to see how different or how much evidence of potential error there was in 2020 compared to 2010. So one question was any evidence of greater quality issues in 2020 for the apportionment counts compared to 2010? And then the second question is to try to rank the states in some way in terms of their risk levels. The general approach that we use basically is to use process statistics by computing them at the state level and overall. We want to compare these to comparable process statistics for 2010 when they were available. And then we would combine these process statistics in some sort of summary measure, what we call the summary process statistic or SPS, and rank the states by this measure. Next slide, please. So the framework that we developed for this basically begins by dividing the census production process into 5 broad phases. There's the master address file development, which master address file is the frame of all the addresses in the United States. The self-response collection phase, which self-response could be paper, phone, or internet, or it could be all three. In other words, you could actually have multiple responses to the census because the Census Bureau did not require that an ID be on the form. You could just have an address. So one could respond with the ID that the Census Bureau sent you through the mail, or that you could respond again on a paper form where you would just put your address, or they could call you and by the phone on phone, and you could respond that way. So there were multiple responses, and non-ID responses were possible. And this is kind of the first time for that to happen. The non-response follow-up, which was follow-up by an enumerator in the field, or when the enumerator couldn't either get a household responder or a proxy, they used administrative records. Data processing was the next step, where if they couldn't get a response from an individual, they would impute a count for the housing unit, and they would impute characteristics. And then we also wanted to look at group quarters because there was a lot of concern about group quarter, particularly college students who may have been counted in 2 places. They were sent home during the pandemic from their colleges and universities, and they may have been counted also there as well as at home. Next slide, please. So the framework goes on then to decompose each of those broad phases further into what we call critical activities. These are activities which I'll explain in a moment are critical to the quality of the census, and particularly for the coverage error. So each of these 5 phases then we identify these critical activities, and then for each of these critical activities, we come up with a process statistic, and then summarizing those process statistics to produce a summary process statistic. And let me show the next slide, which is my attempt to try to explain this a little bit more detail. So one could think in terms of an ideal census. So an ideal census, which is unattainable, would have a complete inaccurate math, would have 100% self-response, and respondents would accurately complete their questionnaires. So any deviation from this ideal then would imply an error risk. So if there's no deviation, as you see on the bottom here, then there's no error. But if there is a deviation, then there's a mitigation activity. And the Census Bureau anticipated a lot of these deviations. Now, they didn't anticipate the pandemic months or years prior to the census, but during the census they did, and they tried to install mitigation activities, which we are referring to as critical activities. So if the mitigation is successful, then you don't have a census error. But if you do, then if it's not successful, then there could be a risk of census error. So the process statistic for critical activity actually reflects the frequency the activity is deployed, with the understanding that the more an activity is deployed, the more the mitigation activity is used, the greater the risk of error, because that would indicate that there's a lot of potential for error, a lot of opportunities for error from that particular error source. So could I have the next slide? So this is sort of what's underlying the use of process statistics in our analysis. Since only a fraction of the errors are successfully mitigated, the larger the process statistic indicates the larger error risk. Now, we're not saying there's presence of error. This is something that we must not fall into this trap of implying that a process statistic indicates the existence of an error. It indicates the existence of an error risk. So could we have the next slide? And the next slide will show then the critical activities that we identified for each of these 5 phases. So for the MAF, it's the additions to the MAF and the deletions to the MAF. So the corrections to the frame that were going on during the census. For self-response, it was, how do you treat these multiple responses that are coming in? How do you treat the non-ID responses? And also, could you find, when it was a non-ID and you had to go by the address, could you find that address on the MAF? Another critical activity was the recording of usual residents at college. So we singled out among all of the usual residents elsewhere indications in the questionnaire, excuse me, we singled out those that were college because, again, this concern about how college students were being counted, given they were their school year was interrupted and they were sent home. For non-response follow-up, it was the treatment of proxy responses, very, very important area. Obtaining only, so in some cases, they only obtained a population count for a household. When they only got a population count, it's not unknown exactly who was counted in that household. Maybe individuals who should not have been counted in the household were counted, or others who shouldn't have been counted, should have been counted, were not. So population count is an indicator of potential error. And then, of course, the enumeration by administrative records, where we know from research that administrative records are sometimes inaccurate, and it's very uneven, the accuracy of administrative records across the U.S. And then for data processing is the imputation of housing unit status, whether a housing unit is I'm sorry, whether a unit is a housing unit or whether it's a business or it's non-existent. So sometimes you don't know and you have to impute that. And if it's imputed as a housing unit, then there might be also be imputing people within that housing unit to count as well as characteristics. Now, the characteristics aren't important for the apportionment because they don't use characteristics, they only use the count, but it is important downstream for substate analysis and redistricting. And then finally, for GQ enumeration, we were particularly interested in the imputation process that was used. Again, the first time that imputation has been used for group quarters, and that was a product of the effects of the pandemic that required that be done. Now, as you can see, these process statistics on the far right there, all of them measure basically the frequency that each of these types of activities was deployed. So let's go to the next slide. And finally, I want to talk about the summary process statistic. And this is just, think of it as just a weighted average of the process statistics. But we implemented one step before we weighted them, and that is we converted the process statistics, because they were all on different scales. We converted these process statistics to quintiles. So the lowest 20% of the states for a particular process statistic was coded 1. The second lowest 20% was coded 2, and so forth. And then the highest 20% was coded a 5. And then the weight we use was sort of, again, related to the importance of that particular activity. So it's the proportion of the state population, the state count that was affected by the critical activity. And we normalize those to 1 so that the summary process statistic would sum to, would be between 1 and 5, just like the quintilized process statistics. So for example, for the weight for the population count only process statistic is basically just the proportion of occupied housing units having a population count only. And of course, that was then normalized. So next slide, please. And we'll now get into some of the results. So let's go right to the results in the next slide. And this is a slide that, this is a graph that we put into our report, which basically is just a visual of the types of modes that were used. And I think we can go to the next slide and it would show a little clearer here how what the numbers are. So we have the data collection methods of self-response, household member enumeration, proxy response, administrative records, and imputed status counts. And you see there on in the second column, 2020 census compared to the 2010 in the far column. And you can see that self-response was actually higher in 2020 than in 2010. Household member enumeration, however, that is actually when you're doing non-response follow-up, getting a person in the household to respond was much lower, 13% to 22. So about 90%, and I would call self-response and household member enumeration preferred techniques. 90% preferred modes in 2020 versus about 93 preferred modes in 2010. So a little less of the preferred mode of response. And the rest of them are fairly comparable, except for administrative records, as you see, were not used in 2010. So we have that error source only in 2020. So next slide, please. And we produced a number of chloroplast maps like this, which basically, this is for the summary process statistic. We have these for all 10 of the process statistics. One can see the distribution in terms of the quintiles across the United States. Let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk very much about these. I just want to show you sort of what kind of data we were producing for this report. This takes the top 7 states, the states with the highest summary process statistics, greater than 4, and looks at the contribution of each of these 5 phases to total uncertainty. And you see by far the self-response was the highest contributor to total uncertainty, followed by the MAF and then non-response follow-up. And let's go to the next slide just to remind you what's involved in these. The MAF is basically the adds and deletes. The self-response is the multiple responses, the non-ID submissions, and the other residents at college. And then the green is the non-response follow-up, is proxies, administrative records, and population count only. And this rest of the states were pretty much the same kind of ordering. Go to the next slide. And the next slide will show you the weights, sort of which of the 10 process statistics were dominant in the weighting. So as you can see here, the MAF revisions, or the adds and deletes, had the largest weight of all of the 10 process statistics, followed by multiple responses, and then proxy responses, and so forth. So not all of these process statistics were weighted the same. In fact, you can look at count imputation and GQ imputation at the bottom, and you can see contributions were minuscule. So they didn't contribute very much at all to the summary process statistic and the rankings. Go to the next slide. To end this presentation, here are some of the major findings that we have in the report. So Alaska, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Texas, Utah, they're the 7 highest states, the states that have the highest risk in terms of how we define risk with these process statistics. Because of the non-ID returns of the multiple responses, they were so much greater in 2020, I should say, not 2010. They were new modes, so those were major contributors to the uncertainty, followed by the MAF volatility, the MAF risk and deletes, error adds and deletes was also much greater than in 2010. The administrative records was used for the first time in 2020. And so that was something that was a higher risk than in 2010, but it was offset somewhat by reduced risk from proxy response, because in a lot of cases, if they hadn't used administrative records, some of those would have turned into proxies, which I think are less preferred, or imputations. And one last thing I wanted to mention is that prior to the Census Bureau published population projections for each of the states And we compared those population, those are based upon survey data and demographic analysis. And we compared those with the actual population counts, and there were some very large discrepancies in some situations. And we could not, the patterns of the process statistics could not explain those deviations. And I think one reason for that is because the population projections themselves could be an error. It's not just all census error. So our process statistics are only looking at census risk. And so, but there was no correlation between those deviations in our in the patterns of the process statistics. And I think this begs I mean, this basically emphasizes the issue that there needs to be much more research on these process statistics and their implications for data quality, because right now all we can say is they pose a risk, but we don't have any idea of how much of a risk or how they're related, in some cases, how they're related to actual coverage error. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Paul. It was truly interesting to understand the complexity with the census, and I think all of us here in Sweden can relate to similar challenges that we also have. Very interesting. Now we are having a 15 minutes coffee break, and when you come back, you will listen to Dr. Stephanie Ekman, and she will have a very interesting talk about using passive data. Please use the ask questions and use the comment function, the chat function on YouTube. And if you tweet, use the hashtag Lyberg Conference. See you in 15 minutes. Welcome back. Now we're going to listen to Dr. Stephanie Ekman. She's especially interested in data quality and using data to answer important questions about society. Stephanie is also a member of Demoskop Scientific Board. I am very happy to leave the word to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Karen. I am very happy to be here and talking with you all today. This is my first mix of live and video presentations that I've done, so I'm excited to see how this goes. I unfortunately have some people here who are doing some work in the house, which turns out to be much noisier than I had expected. So let me know if you can't hear me, if it gets too noisy, and I'll ask them to pause for a moment. As Karen mentioned, I am on the advisory board, so I'm happy to be here representing that as well. Lars is the one who got me involved in working with the advisory board, so it means a lot to me to be here. Lars was really important to me in my career, getting me involved in all sorts of things, especially the TSE 15 conference. I was one of the co-organizers on that, and Lars really put me forward as somebody who could take that on, and I'm very grateful to him for that and all of the support that he gave me. So another reason that it means a lot to me to be here today. Okay, I'm going to get into my talk. I see the slides are up. That's great. Let me pull up my notes here. So I'm going to talk, as Karen said, about using passive data to supplement or replace survey data. And I'm going to draw here a lot from this book that I am working on with my co-authors, whose names you see here on this slide. The book is not exactly on passive data. It's on data collection with wearables, apps, and sensors. But I'm drawing a lot on the material that we've come up with for that book and the discussions that we've had. So I want to just acknowledge the help that I've received from them. And so passive data generally refers to data that are collected not via survey, sort of asking people questions. What did you do yesterday? Who are you going to vote for? What's your household income? Things like that. But passive data means data that we collect without asking those kinds of direct questions or active questions. Passive data, you may have heard this phrase. It's getting a lot of attention recently, but it's not a new concept. There is this book from 1971 called Unobtrusive Measures, which is all about passive data, sort of in a very 1970s sense, not the same way we would use it today, but they were thinking about these issues even back then. So some of the examples that they have in that book are about like drinking in a dry town. If you wanted to understand how much people are drinking alcohol in a dry town is a town that doesn't sell alcohol. You could ask people, but of course there's a concern there that they might lie or underreport, right? So instead of asking those kind of direct questions more passively, you might dig through somebody's trash or recycling and see if you can find beer cans or whiskey bottles or something like that, right? To try to measure drinking. Similarly, if you wanted to know which exhibits were very popular in a museum, rather than asking people which exhibits did you visit today and how did you like them, you could look at the wear patterns on the floor and where do the tiles have to be replaced quite a bit, and then those are the more popular exhibits. So these are very interesting examples, not the kind of passive data I hear people talking about today, but I was interested and excited to hear that that those kind of things were being thought about even back in the 70s. So more commonly these days, we hear about passive data being collected via the devices that we all carry with us, right? So for example, the smartphone that we, most of us probably have in our pockets or on our persons right now, collects a lot of passive data about us. Most obviously, it collects data about the apps that we use. So how often are you on Twitter? How many times do you check your email? Are you playing like games on your phone? So that kind of information is logged and is passive data that we could potentially get off of the phone and use for research if we were interested in that kind of thing. It also contains a lot of information about our social interaction. So how many texts do we send? How many texts do we receive? Do we talk to a lot of people, or do we talk intensely to just a few people? Are we using Twitter or Facebook or other apps like that? Less commonly known, perhaps, is that your phone is always recording your location. So not only when you're using like a map app, or if you're in Uber or Lyft, using your location there, but the phone is sort of always tracking your location because it's talking to these cell phone towers, right? So it always has a sense of what tower it's connected to and always knows where you are in the world. And it's logging often that information. And so that's another source of data, passively collected data, that we could use for research that's to be collected by the phone. And then more recently, I've been hearing about topography, which is the study of the patterns of taps that people make on their phones. So if the speed of the taps changes throughout the day. When we're tired, we tend to tap more slowly. And people are also looking at topography for understandings of cognition or for mental health status. So people with depression have a distinctive pattern in their taps. This is a hypothesis. I don't know that it's been fully vetted in the literature, but it's another kind of passive data that your phone is or could potentially collect about you that you may not be aware of. In addition to smartphones, of course, there are fitness devices, these kind of watches like Fitbits or Garmin's that some of us have and you may be familiar with. They collect information about our steps, the calories burnt, the time and the distance that we run or bike or other sorts of sports like that. And then there are a bunch of new upcoming devices that collect passive data that you may not be familiar with. So in the bottom left corner of the slide here, you see what's called a swallowable. And this is a device that you can swallow that will travel through your digestive tract and collect information about your gut microbiome. A lot of scientists are interested in the gut microbiome, having clues for health. And so this is one way that you can measure that more passively. Not sure how you even measure that actively, but let's not go there. Another option that I don't have a picture for are e-tattoos. So you can get tattoos on your body that measure skin temperature and heart rate and stuff like that. So all this is very cool, in my opinion, right? These devices are definitely innovative and definitely cool. They're collecting a bunch of data with us that me as a survey researcher, a data collection researcher, sounds really fascinating. And my brain starts thinking about all the social phenomena we could study with these data. And I'm not the only one, right? Like a lot of survey researchers, a lot of data collection folks like myself have gotten excited about these devices and are thinking about, well, maybe instead of asking direct survey questions or active questions, right, we can more passively collect that data using these kinds of devices. And so there was a lot of excitement about this, and there still is quite a bit of excitement about these kinds of devices. But let's think more concretely about how we could actually use these data to replace or supplement the survey data that we now collect. So here is a graph showing, this is from regular survey data in the US. This graph shows us for each year the percent of adults meeting the physical activity guidelines in the US. So you can see in 2008, it's maybe about 18%. And in 2017, when this graph ends, it's about 22% of US adults who are meeting these guidelines. And we can see it's bigger among urban adults than rural adults. So this is an important metric of the health of the US population, and we've been tracking this every year for many years in the country. So could we collect these kind of data using a passive device, like perhaps a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something like this? Let's think that through. Here is one of the questions that goes into that graph that we saw yesterday, or saw on the previous slide. The questions have changed more recently. This is a slightly older question. But the question is, how often do you do vigorous leisure time physical activities for at least 10 minutes that cause heavy sweating or large increases in breathing or heart rate? And then you report the number of times. So I think I might just take a moment here for each of you to think about this question and how you would answer it, how you would go through giving a response to this question. I think it's kind of a tough question to answer, right? You have to think about vigorous, which is defined in the question, but still maybe hard to think about, like, what is heavy sweating? What are large increases in breathing or heart rate as opposed to non-large increases, right? You have to think about activity that you did for at least 10 minutes. So maybe if you were chasing the kids around the yard, well, was that 10 minutes or was that just 8 minutes? And then leisure time physical activities. If you have a very physically demanding job, you should take that information or that data out and report only what you did in your leisure time. So could we get this kind of information from a device? Certainly we could. Here is a picture of that device, again, from the previous slide. The device, of course, isn't measuring exactly the same thing. It's measuring, it has an accelerometer in there. It's measuring its position in 3D space. It takes a sample of its position every 1 second or so. Devices sort of vary by that, right? And from that position information, it imputes, I'm waving my arm because I've got an Apple Watch on here. I don't know if you can see that. It imputes this number of steps and the calories that are expended. And the accuracy of the device depends on, how old it is, what brand it is, where it's worn, how it's worn, how tight and stuff it is, like that, right? And let's think about what we might want to consider when we're working this active question on the left side of the slide with the device data on the right side of the slide. And here I'm going to reference Mick Cooper's 5 myths and misconceptions. These are from a talk that he gave in Mannheim in maybe 2018. I really like these. I think he's done a good job of sort of thinking through the things that we need to worry about and the things that we might get wrong when we're thinking about passive data. So the first is the ubiquity myth, the idea that everyone has these devices. Certainly, I have a cell phone. Probably many of you have a cell phone. I also have a fitness device. Many of you, right? I don't have a swallowable. But just because we have some of these devices doesn't mean that everyone does, right? In fact, we know that in many parts of the world, many people share these devices. So a couple might share them, or a child and adult might share them. And then there are many people who just don't have these devices at all. So we can't impute the fact that, like, everyone we know has these devices to the idea that everyone has these devices. And I think we know that kind of sort of conceptually, but when it comes to research, we often think like, well, enough people have them, but we have to be careful about whether that's really true. The second misconception is about the mobility of these devices, the idea that people always have these devices on them. That's not true. My co-author on the book, Florian Keusch, has done some research showing that many people turn their phones off every day, or they don't take them with them all the time when they leave the house. So the idea that these devices are sort of always on and always gathering information about everything we do all day is not accurate. In addition, some aspects of our life are just not mediated through the devices. Some people still read like physical newspapers. And so if you're interested in news consumption, you're not going to pick that up passively from any kind of device at all. Then there's the passive, what Mick calls the passive fantasy, which is that no data collection is really ever truly passive because consent is needed, right? If you're going to go dig through somebody's garbage and look for liquor bottles, you should ideally have their consent to do that. Or if you're going to measure something from their phone or something like that, right? So it's not passive in the sense that they don't have any idea that this is happening. A lot of people like to claim or have tried to claim that privacy is passé. I'm guilty of this myself. That sort of thinking like, oh, people aren't going to be as concerned about privacy in the future. There is some data that the young, older, or they care differently. They can think about privacy a bit differently than we do. Just because the younger generation is maybe eager to share many aspects of their life on TikTok or other platforms like that, that doesn't mean that they necessarily want to share that data with us, right? So there's a difference between like sharing it for their own purposes in their friend groups and sharing it with researchers for reasons that they don't understand. So I don't think that privacy is passe, and we do have to continue to worry about that concern. And then the last myth and misconception is that passive measurements are error-free. And I do see this claim being made in numerous research papers. As survey researchers, we are very well trained to think about all the errors that we have in surveys, right? So Lars was very interested in non-sampling errors. Andrew earlier mentioned non-sampling errors. I could go on about these all day. We think a lot about the errors that we have in our surveys, the comprehension problems with the questions. I've done a lot of work on motivated misreporting, which are these errors that people make deliberately in order to shorten the length of a questionnaire or of a survey interaction. And then of course, social desirability biases, thinking again about that physical activity question. Someone might over-report how much activity they have or they get because they think that they should get that much, or they're embarrassed to say something different in front of an interviewer. So we know quite a bit about the errors in surveys, but I think we are less aware or have less of an understanding of the errors in the passive data. So all of these sources of passive data that we've talked about are also potentially vulnerable to measurement error. For instance, if somebody is using their phone, they might turn that off. The battery might die on a watch, right? They might forget to put the watch on one day. So a lot of these different sources of passive data are also vulnerable to measurement error. And there's also a lot of processing error that I worry about with passive data. And I'll have more to say about that towards the end of the talk. Another issue, the timer says that I've been talking for an hour and a half. That can't possibly be true. Another issue, of course, is just outright fraud. I don't think this is a really big problem, but I did go onto Amazon and just look for devices that will shake your phone for you to make it look like you're walking. So this device, you can buy this on Amazon. You put your phone in there and it just shakes it gently back and forth to up your step count. So if you're an insurance company or something and you're paying people you're reducing the fees for people who get a lot of steps, there's an incentive to use one of these devices. Okay, so let's go back to the question that we looked at earlier about physical activity and whether we're going to measure that by the question or more passively with a device. Thinking about these myths and misconceptions that Cooper laid out, I think we have to think carefully about, we can't count on people to have these devices. Not everybody has like a fitness watch or a smartphone that will track physical activity, so we have to give those out, which is expensive. Even if we give them out, not everybody will accept to wear them, right? Not all of them will measure physical activity in the same way. So if you're using multiple devices, older devices, newer devices, different brands, different wear positions, you're going to have a really big trouble merging all that data together and extracting a signal from it to match the survey question. So the big takeaway here for me from the Cooper's points and just from thinking this through carefully is that both of these methods, the survey measure and the more passive measure, are going to contain a lot of measurement error. And so what can we do about that? Well, I think to get the best out of both worlds, we can combine the two sources. So here I'm showing a multi-trait, multi-method model. This is adapted from a paper that Daniel Oberski and Frauke Kreuter and others and I published in JASA a few years ago. We were using different data sources in that paper, but I think we could do something similar with the physical activity measures. So we've got the two sources on the bottom of the slide, the survey measures of 3 forms of physical activity, and then the accelerometer measures of 3 forms of physical activity. And using this multi-trait, multi-method model, we can combine those and come up with estimates of these latent or unobserved traits at the top of the slide, which are better or less error-prone measures of the 3 aspects of physical activity. I like this model. I have found some data. I'm going to fit it early next year. I haven't done that yet. My concern here, though, is that we're really throwing away a lot of the passive data, right? If we're combining it with that survey question and it just says, how much physical activity do you get in a typical week? We're really throwing away a lot of the detail that's in the accelerometer data, which again is often measured at the second level, right? Every second, where is this device in space? And from that imputing calories burned or steps taken or something like that, right? And so when we merge it, we sort of go to like the least common denominator, which is the survey question, which is a lot less detail. So that's an unfortunate aspect of trying to supplement survey data with this kind of passive data. Here's another example that I'm going to go through a little bit more briefly because I think I might be a little low on time here. But this is from a paper that I wrote with Toby Konitzer and others, recently published in the Public Opinion Quarterly. We compared passive and survey measures of news consumption. This is perhaps more close to what Demoskop and others in the market research field are doing. So we have 3 measures of news consumption, and specifically we're looking at viewership of Fox News channel. We have these 3 survey questions that you see on the left side of the screen, 2 from Pew Research Center and 1 from Gallup, that measure people's viewership of Fox News. And then we had passive data from the Nielsen TV panel, which is a device that connects to a television that measures what channel that television is on. Again, every moment of every day for the length of time a family is in that panel. We found here that the 3 survey estimates are quite different. One is here up here near 40, and then 2 are in the teens. And then when we tried to match that to the passive data, again, we found that the passive data is much sort of richer and has more depth to it. And we can't easily compare it to just one number of like what % of households are watching Fox News in the past week, because it's measured every minute. And so on the x-axis here, we have the number of minutes watching Fox News. On the y-axis, we have the % of adults watching that many or more minutes. So we have about 18% of adults watching 6 or more minutes, 15% of adults watching 12 or more minutes. And this is just how we sort of broke down the very continuous, detailed, passive data that we have. You can see it doesn't really line up with any of the survey estimates, leaving us a little confused about how much people really are watching Fox News. The point I want to make here is that with the passive data, we have to make all these sort of analysis and processing decisions about how we're going to match it up with the survey data if we want to supplement survey data with passive data. If we want to replace the survey data with the passive data, we don't get away from those definitional issues. We still have to think carefully about how we're going to process and use these very detailed, continuous, often, or so frequent that they're almost continuous, passive data. I'm just going to say a few words here about how passive data affects the rest of the survey process. I've talked quite a bit about measurement error and a little bit about non-consent or representation error. But I think that when we start moving towards a passive data world, some of these more passive measures, it makes sense to think about moving from cross-sectional surveys to longitudinal surveys. So the surveys that I've talked about, that National Health Interview Survey, where we looked at the physical activity measurements across time in the US, and some of those measures of news consumption from Pew and Gallup, those are all cross-sectional studies, meaning we select a sample, we ask them questions, and then we're done, right? And we might repeat that survey the next year or the next month or so on, but it's not a longitudinal survey where we're asking the same people over time. Once we start using passive data, I think it makes sense to move to a longitudinal sample because passive data is necessarily longitudinal. It's measuring every second or every minute or every day, right? And a lot of the fixed cost of the data collection is about consenting people, bringing people into the study and getting their permission to use the passive data or to wear the device or so on, right? And so if that's where the cost of the survey is, then it makes sense to keep these people in the study for a longer time and look at phenomenon over time. And Andy Gelman had a paper, or actually a discussion, where he talked about fractal sampling. And I think there might be some connections here with fractal sampling. I'd love to talk to Andrew about that, perhaps in the panel discussion. And then, as I said, I also worry quite a bit about data processing. These passive data are often very big data. I did a small survey with location data just with like 15 or 20 of my RTI colleagues, and the amount of data collected during a week in that study was overwhelming, and I had a really hard time analyzing it and even just like holding it. So we have to be prepared for really big data sets when we're working with these passive data. What I was working with was raw data. And a lot of these devices, like the physical activity measures, some of them will give you the raw data, which is every second, the position in 3-dimensional space. But other ones will give you only pre-processed data. Like if you go with a name brand like Garmin or Fitbit, they're only going to give you access to processed data, which is maybe easier to deal with and won't overwhelm your computer systems quite as much. But it means that you're tied into the algorithms that processor is using, right? If they decide to change the way they process the data, or if they decide to cut off access to that process data, you are left with no recourse, really. So that can be a problem as well. And I don't see people talking enough about the processing of these data. So in the short run, I think I would like to, and I encourage you guys as well, to think about supplementing our surveys with passive data. I think that's the thing we should focus on first, using some of these complex models to combine survey and passive data. We have to worry about the preservation of trends. A lot of my federal government clients, of course, are very worried about preserving trends. You saw that graph that we looked at earlier. We don't want to see we don't want to see breaks in trends there due to the fact that we transitioned to a new measure. So to think carefully about the adjustment in the statistics there. But in the long run, I'd like to see us start thinking about replacing some of our measures with passive data to reduce respondent burden. So respondent burden is something I'm really worried about. But in order to do that, we need a lot more research on measurement error, consent error, and then also on the sampling and processing aspects that I was just talking about. Before I end, this is my standard thank you slide using the RTI template. This is the slide I usually use at the end of my talks, but I wanted to do something a little bit different here. I wanted to say thank you to Lars, or Lasse, as I believe his nickname was. This is a picture of Gaia. Lars would routinely send me pictures of the cat, and he called this one Quality Cat because you can see that Gaia is looking out the window, contemplating 6 Sigma here. I hope you can see that on the slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was beautiful with a picture of Gaia. Yeah, I know you used to swap pictures of your cats. Lasse often talked about that. Now we are introducing Professor Frauke Kreuter, and Frauke, you are co-director of the Social Data Science Center and faculty member in the joint program in survey methodology at the University of Maryland, United States. You're also professor of statistics and data science at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich in Germany, and you are also head of the statistical methods group at the Institute of Employment Research in Nuremberg, Germany. I wasn't sure if you were in the United States or in Germany, but I believe you are in Germany. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thanks for assembling us here to celebrate Lars' birthday, as I learned. So that's perfect. And I do, want to add the series of people having thanked Lars for his impact on their career. And as Lily said it initially so nicely, remembering how he made you feel and his generosity was really unmatched. And I certainly enjoyed discussing with him various quality aspects over the years. And I was always impressed that Lars was sort of timeless. I mean, all these new technology came around, and the peridata, the big data, you name it, and he always pushed us, to think about that and to put that back into the framework and to work on infrastructure and education products. And so I want to piece this together to a set of ingredients that I hope Lars would agree with, that they are sort of ingredients for total quality in a big data world. And I'm just pausing here for a second to make sure that you guys can hear me and can see the slides, since I can't see the chat in parallel. Okay, looks great. Then I'll continue on. So just so that we're on the same page, I do want to give 2 examples for the big data world, and segueing from Stephanie Ekman's talk into this is perfect. I can reference to her work on some of these, but I do want to make sure that so we all understand the importance of these kind of data streams and related ones. And then I want to give these 5 ingredients, 3 on the pipeline side, or what we as data collectors have to be aware of and keep in mind, echoing some of what Andrew Gelman said about design, but then also on the infrastructure side, ingredients that we need in order to move forward properly. So When I talk about the big data world or work I do when I do my research here in Germany, often in the context of labor market research and jointly with the Institute for Employment Research, we've seen over the decades that the changes in how research was done, from observational studies to large-scale surveys with standardized instruments, and in latest installments, and Stephanie referenced some of these smartphone app studies that we have done here, not just to amass passive data that are to be lifted off the smartphones, but also to issue survey questions on these devices. So, changing entirely the infrastructure with which one can collect self-reported data. This development has been exciting, and it is still at the basis of a lot of what these days gets used when we talk about data needed for evidence-based policymaking. If you look at the UN Development Goals, just as one example, and the various activities that national statistical institutes and researchers do to get insights and track and monitor what's happening with respect to sustainable communities, poverties, or economic growth and work types, you see that many of them not only rely on survey data, but they rely on the kind of passive cell phone data Stephanie just introduced in the case of Statistic Netherlands, that are depicting here in this little GIF the commute between home and work. We see this in cell phone and light data being used to indicate spots of high poverty. But we also see an increased use in the US, for example, of administrative data, shedding light on a lot of processes happening in all the countries. For the Northern European countries and for Sweden, we're all way ahead, in terms of using administrative data. But in the US, we see these being increasingly unlocked and allowing for literally big data streams of a different type, not quite as fast, not quite as fluid, but as the reporting systems of administrative processes improve to or are increasingly digitized, those data are bound to become available more frequently as well. Now, the other element to these, evidence-based policy-making pieces, not just a description of the society, but also prescription, if you will, or predictions, we see increasingly in the use of AI instruments that are used or implemented both to just remove labor, if you will, right? If I can automatically scan certificates and make assessments on their trustworthiness and the like through automated agent, that's one thing. But we also see that agencies in many different contexts increasingly use big data streams to funnel them into models that prepare decision making, whether this is the suggestion of what jobs can be taken, or whether these are hiring decisions, training decisions, and the like. There's often limited resources and a need to prioritize. And the hope is that these data streams help with this kind of prioritization. And, you even see this on platforms like LinkedIn or other, this is just one example for an employment labor market platform where text is automatically read and matches are created between job seekers and those that offer jobs. All these also use data streams. And if you think about total quality in a big data sense, I think we as survey methodologists or, second, third generation Lars Lyberg, that we have a responsibility to think as those kind of analyses being an outcome to be produced and the data needing to fit the results. And this is particularly true when we talk about high stakes decisions, such as those in a judiciary system, where, one could argue that one could make this decision making more efficient and maybe more effective. with the overarching goal to reduce inmates. But this can only work if the algorithms are good, which is, maybe not at the core of our profession, but also only work if the data streams that go in are of good quality. And so that leads these two elements of sort of monitoring what's going on in society and shaping what's going on in society that we see increasingly happen, bring me to these 5 ingredients to be thought after. The first one, I think it is really important to understand the research goal at hand. So if we look at the current situation we're all in, and questions like these two, what is the vaccination rate and who takes up vaccines? This would be a typical question where we can face a couple of different data streams, but a natural one would be to run a survey and employ a survey data collection company to do so. Interestingly, with the vaccine uptake, there are administrative data available, and depending on the country, maybe even depending on the states within the country, the administrative data are, of course, also of different quality, but so are the survey data. There's a newly published paper by Bradley et al. On ArchiveX as a preprint that has in the appendix this nice graph that compares different surveys done in the US from online panels that, for those of you who are in the business, have quite different recruiting techniques. They also had different question wordings, and looking at this graph, of course, we can't disentangle the measurement error part from the sampling part. But one thing we do know is, looking at these data, that at least in the US and for Germany, I can say for sure, being able to access vaccination has something to do with my access to the internet, or at least initially had, because the most effective way to get a vaccination appointment was going online and making such appointment, and without proper access or skills to do so, that would have been quite difficult. And so it's not surprising that some surveys might overestimate or the vaccination uptake if they rely entirely on internet as a vehicle. And this is the case for 2 surveys here that have had quite a large number of cases contributing to the survey itself. Continuous monitoring stream done by the Delphi group at Carnegie Mellon, and the Census Household Pulse survey in the US. And so this paper by Bradley et al. Compares these to the CDC benchmark and the much smaller survey done by Axios Ipsos in a probability-based access panel. And it is interesting, though, that here, coming back to the research question, right? So while the internet-based or web-based data collections with populations that might not cover the entire US overshoot in their point estimates here, if the research question is more related to the things that we see on the right, which is which education groups are more likely or less likely to be vaccinated, then while the level of these 3 surveys differ, the ranking of these education groups does not and tell us the same story. So you see an example here for sort of a variation in what can be learned from these data depending on the research question and what we likely think are the confounding mechanisms. But looking at that same data stream, and full disclosure, I was involved in an international version of that data collection. If we go back to 2020, when the initial first questions were, how is the pandemic developing and where are the next hotspots? There were just no data available. And there was not an easy way to track on a daily basis what's happening and to see on a daily basis, how are things moving around. And so a series of public health researchers of various one, including folks from the WHO, had approached Facebook to ask if they could issue an invitation to a survey on the Facebook platform. And we have seen in the field, what you see on the right-hand side, an advertisement to take a survey. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is daily random sample that was taken from all active Facebook users every day anew in the countries that Facebook is allowed to operate, with the same sampling mechanism stratified by region 1, so states in the United States or Germany, within each country, with known selection probabilities and a whole slew of variables available to Facebook about the respondents for a non-response adjustment. And so with this setup, one can argue that, of course, as daily snapshot, it is possible to monitor the development of the pandemic, assuming that those that report are in a context that sort of mimics how the pandemic develops, that the likelihood to get infected is unlikely to be highly correlated to Facebook. But more importantly, the survey included questions like this community COVID-like symptom indicator, where the question wasn't just asked about an individual person, but about knowing someone in the local community who is sick with fever and the cause or difficulty breathing. And this kind of combination of social sensing and daily tracking did allow, in a comparative fashion across the world, to get indicators. And as later on test cases came about and hospitalization rates, it turned out that this indicator, in particular the community COVID index that I showed you before, was quite predictive of the development of the pandemic in many countries. So in this first ingredient, I think in order for alternative data sources to work, or before we shun one and fully embrace another, it is important to have the research goal and the research question in mind, whether this is a description, which is usually the hardest part, whether this is a conversation with the kind of inference challenges that Andrew Gilman talked about, or whether we are talking about a prediction situation. And with the prediction also, if that's a prediction that I do in order to know what's happening next week, or if this is a much more ambitious or difficult task on longer terms prediction that we are trying to achieve. Now, the second ingredient is then to understand data generating processes. And Stephanie did a great job in showing problems that can appear with these passive data collection measurements. If we take data streams from other sources, we also have to think about that. And, only in rare occasions is it, blatantly evident why or that data stream might have a bias, or might not be really a true reflection of what's going on. As an example here, my data stream would be images that one gets, for example, through Google image search. I've done this over the years, getting these, nice mix of universities professors when I type in that as a keyword. And then all of a sudden, from 1 month to the next, the population of university professors, according to this image data stream, had entirely changed. Of course, what changed was a deliberate, algorithm that shows these data and an effort by Google to have more diversity in these kind of image results that get fed back. And, as knowing what distributions can be like or should be like, this looks, balanced on gender diversity, but then of course might also not be the right reflection of reality. This is unlikely to be a data stream we use for social science research, but it is one that, because we know so much, is an easy one to understand the problem. So no matter which data stream we're at, though, we are, in charge of thinking about this ingredient to understand the process with which the data were generated. And then my third aspect here, and this is, I guess, a different version to say what Andrew said earlier about how the analysis is done. I would call it, you need to know your audience and how the data is used later on, not just a scientific audience and whether a multi-level model is fit or whatnot, but how the results are taken. And information usually gets processed with the goal in mind, right? If I am a politician and have to make a decision based on these COVID data, I'm likely to not pay too much attention to error bars. The press or government politicians, they might jump, and all they need to see is data representative, and then they overlook that this really often just means it's adjusted for age and gender, and not at all a true reflection of the population. And while we can make all kinds of claims in our data releases, having this transmitted and portrayed in a way that really everybody can understand it is quite a different story. And then likewise, if people do take the results individual, often what they're interested in, what does that mean for myself and my own probability to be affected by something. So in addition to these three pipeline ingredients, understanding the research goal, understanding the data generating process, understanding your audience, for this to work, for data quality to really come to flourish, we do need to also look at the data protection elements and the fitness for use in data security. When I go hiking, I put hiking boots on. They protect my feet in that sense. When I go, to the North Sea, I need to have different shoes to protect my feet. Not every data security will be the same one. And I think, as Stephanie pointed out, much more research is needed to know what are the sensitivities here. And we have seen over the pandemic that people who were very hesitant to share their health data with government entities changed that response in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is possible if we create environments in which safe data can meet safe people and work on safe projects. We have demonstrated that this is possible with a collaboration of over 40 agencies as part of the Coleridge Initiative. But that is not the only piece. If we have such environment, we need to make sure that data that are housed in those are really findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this required that we rethink how we store the data and how we make them available for the new data, the unstructured data streams that come with big data. We're not there yet. There are a lot of puzzles to solve. And, while when we do surveys and experiments, it's sort of clear how the workflow happens. When we work with big data, there are complex processes and analyses at the end that we have to take into account, and they need to be documented properly. In Germany, we were lucky and got funded to build such an environment. I hope for international collaboration on these topics. And in the spirit of Lars's outreach and training next generations, we are hoping to augment with these existing programs and courses that are offered not just for students, but also for the workforce. Here are two examples for courses anyone can enroll, and I would like to invite you to it. So closing out, I do think that there is a lot of interesting opportunities ahead, but we want to make sure that we keep those 5 ingredients in mind, and I will keep Lars in mind when I work on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frauke. It was really interesting. And I think, for me at least, it was a very good way to structure this whole very complex area. Thank you. Now we are moving on to the next and our final speaker, Johanna Laurane. She is the Deputy Director General of the Information Process at Statistics Finland. And she's responsible for the information process and modernizing statistics production. Welcome.
Thank you, and it is my pleasure to be here in Demoskop Quality Conference. And I would like to thank Karin Nelson for organizing the conference to honor Lars Lyberg, and thank you for the invitation. I have known Lars since 1998, meeting him in non-response workshop that Lily mentioned for household surveys that was held in Slovenia. And I must say that I felt very warm welcome by the entire senior group of the great scientists. And I kind of felt that Lars adopted me, like many other young statisticians, into his global team to be trained as applied survey methodologist. So he gave a lot of insight and a lot of guidance to take the wisdom that we had been given in the university and in the theoretical lectures, but he was really truly training us to become professionals. And he was a great mentor, keeping even from distance, occasionally contact, and giving really great insights. He as well reminded constantly on combining both the vision with the realism and on how to manage with costs and quality components. My talk, if I can try to share this, I'm trying to share the slides. Maybe I have the same problem as Paul Beamer. I don't know if you can help me with this. Yes, great, thank you. My talk on the survival of the fittest data collection strategies in the digital transition of social surveys reflects the approach Lars taught to question the approaches that we have believed in and how to become courageous to be conducting surveys in smarter fashion using the potential of digitalization, for example, nowadays. Okay, great. Maybe changing the slides may work from here now. Let's see. So on this strategy map slide, I wish to emphasize the requirements and the challenges to compete with the new information requirements that give for us statisticians both potential but also challenges that I would like to see as problems that we are solving. We should be looking into the increasing complexity of the required information content while aiming to increase the timeliness of the surveys, exploiting the new technologies and methods. The corona crisis and climate change, they are, for example, new phenomena that shake the requested information content as they have holistic impact to the social structures and our behavior. And instead of using a yearly, quarterly, or monthly statistics that are traditionally from the official statistics side where I come from, our products, we have to now speed up and produce more frequently information as our general public and also policymakers have used to monitor the developments and impacts of COVID on daily basis. So monthly statistics can be as well not meeting the demands anymore of our customers. So this adds pressure with the improved IT for official statistics and social surveys to change, utilizing new data sources like the mobile data, scanner data, these passive data that Stephanie was explaining, and also having access to my data, utilizing data fusion methods. These provide new development paths and also research problems that can either be seen as problems, research problems that attract data scientists. And in official statistics, national statistical organizations, we are not only the bank of information, but we are as well a bank for research problems. In Statistics Finland and a few other national statistical offices, we have approached this by launching experimental statistics that are published in additional sites, and they are alternatives to the traditional official statistics. The speediness of statistics can be increased utilizing these new methods like nowcasting, and it is crucial to share new solutions across the statistical domains, such as comparing the solutions from business statistics with the ones that we are tackling in social statistics. The statistical organizations are also expected to provide more than just a final statistics as services, and we are prone to develop new embedded services from data collection to data release and services to the research community, like better access to data and combining different data sources together, but also discussing and having better dialogue with the researchers of the potential usage of all the information we have. So receiving and extracting information has also become harder from our data providers and respondents, but this can be tackled with maintaining the trust to exchange of data and gaining good cooperation from the respondents. The treasuring the trust to data collectors and producers is truly essential as well for further usage of the statistics, but also for the future surveys. And here I have a slide presenting the recent information that we have from the citizens' pulse in Finland. We have in few international organizations a kind of schemes for how to measure trust, either trust to official statistics or trust to the institutions. And this is a national example that I thought could be interesting for you. It gives a glimpse of the current status to trust to various institutions in Finland. And we have this in frequent monitoring, and through the pandemic, we have been able to monitor how the trust is changing or whether it is changing. And people were first asked before this question, in general, how much they do trust to other people, and then asked how much trust do you have to the following institutions. And quite surprisingly, the level of trust has remained relatively stable over the pandemic, which is good news as well for us collecting the data for social surveys. And it is, I think, something anyhow, although the situation has been relatively calm in our survey climate, that we, the survey operators, needs to be alert to maintain and monitor whether the trust is kept at the same level, or if there are issues that we need to take on board, for example, when communicating with the respondents in surveys on how we are treasuring the information and for what purposes we are collecting it, and if there are any other secondary usage of data. So there are all the time threats that may affect our survey climate, and one of them we have identified is the increasing impact of fake information, also the scams via telephone. So it is really important that we are differentiating from other call attempts, that the data collection is actually true and honest extraction of the data and exchange of information. Then, of course, there are cyber attacks that are either targeted to companies or organizations who maintain confidential information, for example, in health companies. And this alerts as well the citizens about providing and releasing the data. So these are really important elements to maintain in our mind. So I think these can be seen as dark clouds, but dark clouds to overcome with lots of potential. So if we look at the into the elements of the surveys and how we can redesign surveys. This can be seen as immense power in the flexibility to adapt to the difficult circumstances. And the resilience of survey designs is really embedded power. The difficult to measure areas such as the impact and preparedness for climate change or impacts of COVID crisis can be extracted partially from registers in some countries and like in Finland, and we can as well use the passive data like mobile data for the patterns of behavior, the patterns of moving and so. But however, we need to gain as well more insights information, and this insights information of the people, of the attitudes, of the experiences, this actually can be extracted most reliably through surveys with new added on questions. And the quickest tools are actually surveys. Even in register-based statistics production, like in Finland, we are really heavily as well reliant on the flexibility of the survey information content. The digitalization of surveys as well provides a lot of power into adapting, and we can move forward from data collection into data exchange that I'm speaking about. So we need to utilize these possibilities in a new manner and as well utilize the service design of surveys so that the respondents feel that they are not only asked occur questions, but they must receive something as feedback for the time that they are spending with our interviewers or with our questionnaires. So we have to provide the data providers better service as well as maintaining the confidentiality of the data. And it is, I think, that one of the main messages for them that they are helping the decision makers with providing their information and their insights, but also that we are protecting their data and it is for a good cause. The digital transformation. Sorry, digital transformation. This is something where we are actually living in, and the use of technologies are given to us as a better way of improving our services. There is as well resistance with survey researchers. We wouldn't like to break the long time series. We would like to have comparison over time and also maintain the comparison over countries. But at the same time, we need to identify and recognize that the reality is changing as well. So by utilizing better big data sources, by actually not only testing but utilizing intensively robot interviewing in testing functionalities and establishing initial contacts, we are making it possible to provide much more information as the use of resources must become more efficient. Also, the mixed mode data collections, they are now including video interviews. We need to utilize the web scraping. In Finland, we are using this intensively in consumer price indices, but this is moving forward in our tests. And the mobile data from operators is used partially, but it would be really essential to have better access to this data. And the embedded artificial intelligence for automated validation is as well important, because by this we are able to speed up the production, but also learn about the new classifications and see how the classification systems of official statistics should change. The mobile diaries and respondent-friendly applications are as well something that we are in force to bring in, as we must deliver better services and recognize that the statistics only portray the reality if we change while the society and the structures are changing. The impact of the digitalization doesn't only uh, give us new opportunities in our profession, but we must see that the society is changed by the digitalization. The patterns of our daily lives are in huge structural change, and the mobility of people has changed, but also the way we live, work, and how we educate ourselves. This has become completely differently from the times when the official statistics in many surveys were developed. And also traditional characteristics like the family structures have become um, um, different. The families are not anymore like nuclear families, they are more like networks, and even gender has been recognized to be more complex than a binary code. So our traditional coding and classification systems are in question, and we need to utilize the digital way of trying to keep them up to date. The telephone interviewing in Finland has become mobile, and also by this graph I just wish to um, envisage our interviewing framework at the moment. That we don't have much fixed line numbers anymore in use in Finland, and most of the messaging and calls are in mobile networks and in mobile phones. And this brings in challenges as well, as the mobile numbers are changed quite frequently, and as well the the mobile operators are actually offering or asking the clients whether they would like to have their numbers secure. So then in Finland, we are in the situation where the use of listed numbers doesn't anymore give us as easy access to link the survey information with the registers, and we have increasing challenge with the reduction of the quality of contact details, and this is something where we are really working on hard. We are as well tackling the problem with the linkages. They both, with different records, they give us great opportunities, but as well, they seize some possibilities to publish data more quickly. As we are in register-based statistics, we are imposed with the timelines of the register producers. And there can be as well changes in the register information context that then affect our resources. So we need to have a constant communication with the register operators. And we all know that the motivation of respondents is as well increasingly dependent on well-designed persuasion strategies and communication. And in Finland, we have just recently nominated in Statistics Finland a spokesperson that is specifically specialized for communicating to the general public and to the selected respondents, sponsors and supporting organizations on the importance of the data collections to improve the survey climate. And we think that all in all, it is important that we keep in mind that the data protection by design is as well supported by the legislation, and we must recognize it has an impact on the brand of the organization, of our reputation, but it also gives the grounding for smooth operations and stresses the trust to be capital for future surveys. Thus, it is really important that when we move to digitalized operations, that we are having the digital solutions as safe as possible, because in social surveys we are dealing with sensitive data. Here we have the shared knowledge and the shared trend of increasing non-response trends in Finland. And we are at some surveys even reaching over 50%. This can of course be tackled with better estimates on the reliability of the estimates. When we can utilize the auxiliary information, but still I think we are reaching the critical levels in some surveys. We have as well one survey here, the EU Silk survey, where we use incentives, and so we can see the impact of the incentives as well. But with the incentives, we think that we can have as well some inflation, and we have budget limits, so it is important to consider how much we are paying for the responses, or motivating respondents with different competitions or awards. But all in all, I think it is really important to press the information sharing approach in motivating respondents, and using the service design that we are valuing the time of respondents, and by increasing the timeliness of the statistics, we are as well providing the respondents the feedback for them in a way that it can be seen as a trade-off. But if the statistics is released, for example, half a year or a year after, it is too long to be seen as a reward for their time. The optimal use of resources is highly important, so that we can, with the optimal usage, we can actually flourish, and the whole statistical program that is having a lot of information content, and we are able to increase the information content of specific surveys. And all the time when managing the statistics, we must see whether the costs are relevant or good causes for receiving more funding, versus how much the information is needed. And in this graph, I have used the financial term ROI, a return of investments, in the relation of how the costs of producing statistics has been developing over time in Finland, and as well how the usage of statistics has been developing from web. So we are monitoring the costs as average costs in €1,000 here on the left-hand side of the graph, and on the right-hand side we have the axis portraying the use of statistics, how many thousands of extractions of tables we have per month from our websites. And I think this really emphasizes that when we are looking after the statistics, that it is utilizing the new technologies, we can have some increases, but as now we have decreases as the investments are paying off. And at the same time, we are able to have a better usage of the statistics. If the usage of statistics would be reducing, then I think we should be really worrying that we would be doing something incorrect. And with this, I think it is really important to see that investments for fact-based statistics pays off for the society. And if I was to make a bet, I would bet that the flexible surveys that allow the new methodologies and experiments utilizing new sources of data, they would be the winners, and they would survive best. So I would really like to thank Lars for his guidance, and all of you for your attention, and looking forward to the panel discussion and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's very interesting to hear how you work in a neighboring country. So we are a bit short of time for the panel discussion, but I invite all of the speakers to join the panel discussions. And I have a broad question to ask all of you. Maybe I would start with Andrew. Considering the new survey landscape, what are the biggest opportunities for this new landscape?
Um, I I don't I think I don't know. Opportunity is funny. It seems like it's kind of the opposite, that there's a lot of ways that things can go wrong. So maybe I
Question.
guess we just have to
Challenges.
well, I guess we just have to start from the standpoint that people are going to be making decisions, like political or business decisions. Maybe think about the COVID, how difficult it's been. There's been a lot of public figures who have said it's too bad that we don't have random sample data. So there's a lot of general recognition of the importance of that and the importance of sampling. It's just so difficult because who gets tested is nothing like a random sample, and people get tested because they may have symptoms. So I guess in terms of, there are a lot of opportunities in public health that would combine better modeling with better data collection.
Thank you. What is your take on that question, Paul?
I have to agree
Opportunity.
with Andrew. I think that I look at it as saying more opportunities for study of error risks, because I think that the new methods, the new data sources, and so forth, although they're convenient, and I think they've been not used in the past because we've had better methods, but some of those better methods now are not so good. So trying to get information that's reliable and being able to know whether it's reliable, how reliable it is, and that's going to be a challenge. So I think the opportunities are for people who work in an area where they're evaluating survey and these other data sources and being able to say something about their uncertainty.
Thank you. Stephanie, on that note, I remember a speech that you held at the Big Sur in Barcelona, where you were talking about the accuracy in the passive data, and that there was different accuracy between different devices. So has that situation changed, or are you more optimistic, or are there still new challenges that you have recognized?
No, I don't think that challenge has decreased in any way. We only see more devices and more differences between them, right? And I'm really concerned about this, the idea that some of these data are pre-processed and locked away. So I wear this Apple device. It tracks all sorts of interesting things about my fitness and my heart rate, and yet I can't get that data, right? I can't get it out and merge it with like my headache diary or my time card at work or anything like that, right? And so when we think about using these data for social science research, there's a lot of data that we can't access in a raw way and process it the way we want to. It's processed by these large companies in ways that suit their needs, and then they do or don't share it with us, and they change those algorithms anytime they feel like it. And so those are the kind of things that I am really worried about going forward. How are we going to not only get access to this data in terms of like privacy and consent, but then ensure that the data we get access to, that we understand where it comes from and what it means.
And thank you, Stephanie. And Frauke, I was thinking when you talked about the different ways of collecting data, now with Facebook was one example that you used, and we know that Facebook users, they tend to get older and older, and young people, they are on other platforms. Is maybe Meta, the new company, or the new name of the company at least, is that a solution, or is that how we're going to do surveys going forward, or what do you think?
I think that none of these channels alone will be the solution. I think that the combination of data sources is something that we should have as a design principle in our mind from the get-go. But I do think that there are research questions for which other platforms do work, and or I would say, I mean, Lars was always sort of focusing us on sort of fit for use or fit for purpose, right? And I think in this particular examples where, you know, a world has changed daily and or very fast, weekly at least, right? It is, you know, an instrument that has worked for other research questions, even in the public health space. It might not, right? I mean, if the world isn't that changing that fast, we have time to do much better data collection and random sampling, right? So I think having sort of, I mean, I stressed it before. I think the purpose is important, and then it is important to not overstate for the reasons that Paul and Andrew just mentioned.
Thank you. Johanna, I can't help but going a bit local here. We have over 400 participants watching this conference from all over the world, but going local. You and I talked prior to your talk about the differences and the similarities between Sweden and Finland. You have close contact with Statistics Sweden. What do you think are the greatest differences between our two countries, or maybe similarities?
Well, I think the similarities are that we are both really eager to experiment the new statistics and the experimental statistics. We are both pressed to become more efficient and utilize new data sources. And then the differences are where we are able to gain and negotiate these new data sources, but both countries and the politicians in both countries are as well recognizing that the paradigm are changing, and we are within the European Union, both countries, and the problem is that the statistical regulations are not changing that quickly or that smoothly than the data requirements for the policy needs are changing. Like Frauke was mentioning, that the structures and the societies and the data needs are changing now so quickly that the official statistics must as well speed up. Otherwise, other sources will be used more. So I think there are more changes in the larger scale that are similar to the countries. The differences are there whether we are ahead of utilizing mobile phones in Finland, or whether you are ahead of moving to utilize more data fusion techniques for example, in household uh, consumption survey. I think you are there something like a few years ahead of us, and we are seeing our forecasts by seeing the crisis that you are dealing with.
Thank you, Joanna. And with this short panel discussion, I say thank you very much for participating in this conference. It has been recorded, and we will send out the link afterwards. Our ambition is to make this a yearly event, and I wish you all a happy holiday.